You're in an elevator. You overhear a producer say, "My next project is a giallo film, but it needs a title. Whoever gives me the best title will direct the project with a blank check attached." What is the title you're throwing in?
So I have, I think, a pretty good one. The name for the space in your mouth between like your cheeks and your teeth is called the vestibule. So I think a movie called Vestibule. And a guy sees somebody get like stabbed through the face, maybe through like the window of like a hotel or like an apartment in the vestibule. And then he either becomes like a suspect or gets maybe hunted down by the killer.
I'm not going to lie. I thought the first part was the pitch, the space between your mouth.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was sort of going the other way also, right? Because for me, I feel like the ideal, the like epitome of the giallo title is like Agatha Christie, but more opaque. Right. So I was going more like the antique aroma of her nightingale.
Something like that. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
But vestibule's tight. It's loaded.
Vestibule sounds more like a 2008 Dario Argento movie.
It could also be that, yeah.
Also, it's surprising no one's ever done Blood and Black Gloves, or maybe they have.
Blood and Black Lace, but
right. Oh, yeah, being the famous one, and no one's ever like twisted it to Blood and Black Gloves. I feel like it could be either like a POV movie where you're really focused on the killer, or it could be like a giallo movie where the victims are primarily male. Could be like a twist on the usual format.
I do like that the giallo title doesn't lock you into a lot. You know?
Oh yeah.
No, they're usually very evocative, but like also tell you completely nothing.
Like absolutely nothing.
Or especially the Argento titles.
Yeah. Or it'll mention a thing that you see in one scene.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, yeah. There's that.
The best I could come up with was with the animal trend, the bark of the decaying hellhound.
Ooh.
Oh, I like that.
Scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm scared just thinking about it.
That's like an early 80s giallo.
There we go.
I love the idea, though, of people doing pitches based on just titles. I think, like, Stuart Gordon, Castle Freak, was, I think he was given that based on just the title. Like, they had a title and needed to make the movie, and he was like, it's got to have a castle, it's got to have a freak.
I frequently work from titles. I'll, like, come up with a nice title, and then I'll spend 2 years gestating on it, and then I'll have an outline, but I often work from titles. I think it's a great way to go.
I just love that giallo titles are like the greatest metal songs that don't exist.
Oh, that's true. That's another way to just think of like a Black Sabbath song, and that's a good way to invent one.
Yeah, the lizard in the woman's skin. Like, I want to hear that.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Split Picks. We are once again discussing the great Italian horror directors for this year's October Horror Series. First, we looked at Dario Argento's The Stendhal Syndrome and The Phantom of the Opera. Those were with Bennett and Steve Collins.
Those are such funny Argento picks.
It was we had to split into two episodes.
They're both so good, if you ask me.
Yeah. Bennett has, a deep love for the Phantom of the Opera that I don't think is too common, but, he did a great job defending his love for it. Last week, we turned to Lucio Fulci. We looked at The House by the Cemetery and A Cat in the Brain, and that was again with Bennett and Frankie Veneria. This has been a great series so far. I think it's been a ton of fun. This week, we once again have Bennett Glace back. Are you ready for round 3, Bennett?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm feeling very Italiano.
I'm a little intimidated by your experience at this point. I feel like you're such a veteran split pixer that I'm going to have to really come out swinging to beat you.
Don't worry, I'm as much of a pseudo-intellectual as ever. Don't worry.
And if you couldn't tell, we also have Jim Hickcox back. But
Hi.
He politely has given me my hosting seat back. Jim, how are you doing?
Good. You know what? I prefer being on this side of the table.
It was a great episode with you hosting about...
I appreciate you saying that, but it's more fun for me because here's the thing, is that you do so much work and research, and I don't like doing that.
It's a great contrast.
I like showing up and knowing barely anything and then just saying whatever I want.
I did love Jim. I think my favorite part about that episode was the intro, because I could tell you were actually nervous, and I've never heard you nervous before, because you just took off like, "Hello, welcome to Split Pick Time, Jim," and then you settled down. But I love that. It's just like, yes, we rattled Jim.
Yeah.
The conclusion was incredibly smooth, though. The transition to like, I think the winner is Roy's World.
Thanks. Thank you.
Today we are talking about Sergio Martino. We're going to be looking at his first giallo film, and one that has a pretty informative title as to what it's about.
That's true. This one is pretty direct, I guess. His titles are, in general, his titles are a little more direct than a lot of giallo titles.
Definitely.
He's given you a chunk of meat with the title on almost all of them.
Yeah.
Torso is one of the best titles, and I often get it confused with Pieces. Pieces is the one with the famous taglines. They're very different movies, but I often will credit those taglines to Torso.
Oh, I don't know what the tagline is for Pieces.
You don't have to go to Texas for a chainsaw massacre, and it's exactly what you think it is.
Well, yeah, Torso is exactly what. Right, Torso, I was like. We're like immediately launching off on not the movie you want to talk about.
Into, like,
but it is exactly what it says on the box, right? They're like, this movie is going to be all nude women and violent death, and then it is.
And like dismemberment, you're gonna be left with some torsos,
pieces,
or pieces. Yeah.
Well, Jim, do you want to tell us what your film is today and a little bit about why you selected it?
Yeah. Yes. I'm coming out representing The Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh with an H on the end. And I am, and I've chosen it because I watched all of Martino's giallos, and it's the best one. It's why.
That's a very good reason.
Thank you.
Bennett, how about you?
Yeah, so I should say, just piggybacking off of what Jim just said there, saying it's one of Martino's best giallos, or it's the best of Martino's giallos, is basically saying it's one of the best giallos, gialli ever made. He made 4 or 5 of them, and they're all really kind of like the cream of the crop, all really great. And part of my inspiration for my pick, Slave of the Cannibal God or Mountain of the Cannibal God, is I wanted to pick a non-giallo film. One of the great things about Martino, much like Lucio Fulci, who we talked about last week, is he worked across the kind of broad range of genres that we associate with Italian cinema. In this case, the cannibal film.
Yeah.
It's a subgenre that I've kind of avoided on reputation because, like, not all that into the idea of seeing like animal cruelty or like the worst of like animal on animal nature film violence. But I don't know, this one was on Tubi. I was in a Martino mood a couple months ago, and I saw this and I was like, hey, it's if they were all like this, then I might be more into watching cannibal films. It's a pretty good example of the subgenre, much like his giallos. Or gialli, excuse me. I'm probably going to correct myself every time I make that mistake.
Well, now I have to try to do that too. So now we all are.
So once again, today is not going to be a career-spanning look at Sergio Martino. As Bennett teased, he has made a ton of movies. So we're going to be looking at 2 films today to just kind of see what they tell us about his career as a whole. Before we get into Strange Vice, though, Bennett, there is a connection between a piece you wrote 2 years ago for October Horror and some of the topics we'll be talking about today. What can you tell us about the links between Bob Hope's movie Joys and The Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh?
So among the many kind of baffling things about Joys, which for those unfamiliar, and why would you be familiar unless you're an avid listener of Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal podcast circa like 2015, Joys was a Bob Hope TV special. I can't remember the year off the top of my head, probably like 77, 78. And the title is riffing on Jaws, ostensibly. They call it centers on a killer who they refer to as a shark. But much more than a parody of Jaws, it's a sort of giallo riff. There's a black-gloved killer. People are kind of picked off one by one. The killer sort of taunts the victims. It's very much Bob Hope doing classic Italian horror movie in the style of Mario Bava, Dario Argento, or Sergio Martino, featuring an incredible cast, including Groucho Marx in his last filmed appearance.
Whoa!
Yeah.
So if you want to see, at death's door, Groucho Marx in a truly abysmal made-for-television comedy special, look no further than Joys. with an exclamation point.
Yeah. 1976.
I wish Old Man Groucho was one of the things it had in common with Mrs. Wardh.
Right, yeah. Well, funny you should ask, Craig. Now, all of our listeners are certainly familiar with Groucho Marx.
Can I get both of you to give me just your quick scouting report on Sergio Martino as a director? Just what do you feel are his strengths, what indicates his style, and how do you feel his work stacks up against some of the other Italian greats?
A thing that I noted, and again, I watched his giallos and a couple of other horror-y things. I didn't go into his sex comedies or his sports movies or his whatever. I really wanted to watch Arizona Cult Returns because for a minute I thought it was going to be a riff on Indiana Jones, but then I realized it was made before Indiana Jones. So I don't even know what it is. He like maybe a Western-y thing.
I think it's a Western, yeah.
But I didn't dip into any of that. I mostly watched his horror. But one of the things that really struck me was, and this might be more indicative of myself as a consumer of Italian films, but I feel like the way that I've consumed giallos before is the way that I think a lot of people have, where I've seen 4 Argentos, 2 Bavas, and a Fulci, right? Where I've seen like kind of the things where people are like really wiling out and pushing, trying to bend the genre. And Martino doesn't mess with that. He's just like, I'm going to make rock solid entries into already existing shapes and not try to like do something wild and crazy with it. It's all of, or at least all the ones I watched are like premier examples of the things they are without really any pretensions of doing anything with it.
Yeah, I first came to Martino through his gialli. Your Vice is a Locked Door and Only I Have the Key. All the Colors of the Dark. Those are sort of like heavy hitters. And yeah, he doesn't seem to be ever like trying to reinvent the wheel. And nevertheless, he just really makes incredible films.
Yeah.
I noted in our kind of like document discussing the films, like conventional is a word that's usually deployed as a pejorative. You're usually talking about somebody like Ron Howard, like, oh, these films are conventional, they're down the middle, they're unexciting. But like, I don't know, like you can't help but compare Martino to his countrymen and genre compatriots, you know, Argento and Fulci and Bava. And while he has kind of wild, outlandish, throw everything at the wall movies like American Rickshaw, I mostly associate him with these genre movies that are really just rock solid.
Yeah.
And like not trying to like disarm you or upset you even when they are, or I guess they do upset you. Not trying to like disarm you or confuse you even when they deploy dream logic. Like Mrs. Wardh is a remarkably easy to follow giallo movie, despite all of its like crazy twists and despite the really effective dream logic. And I think Case of the Scorpion's Tail, which honestly, if you hadn't picked one of his other giallos, I might have picked that one. That's one that's like kind of arguably a giallo, arguably just a murder mystery. Yeah. There's a sequence in that movie where the killer is like cutting a hole through a door, and all you hear on the soundtrack is like the knife scraping the wood.
Yeah.
If that were a Fulci or an Argento movie, there would be a really over-the-top soundtrack on that. And I think there's like an example of where you can see Martino set himself apart too. Like, I don't know, like the movies we're talking about both have really good, like notable soundtracks, but they're not deployed to the sort of like disarming ends that Fulci and Argento often deploy their soundtracks.
Yeah.
And I kind of think if Goblin had been associated with like Martino instead of Argento, he might be as notable a filmmaker.
It is
as great as these scores are. They're not like insistent and instantly iconic in the way that those are.
That is absolutely true. I did note that there's like 4 or 5 gialli from the like 70 through 74 or 5, right? And then there's a gap, and then there's Scorpion with Two Tails is 82, and it's like distinctly there's a jump where you're like Suspiria happened in between here because he's like bringing in, suddenly there's like mysticism involved, right? And the soundtrack isn't Goblin, but it'll like they've listened to Goblin, you know. There's like a distinct stylistic shift between the 70s and the 80s for him, which makes sense given sort of how he's operating. But the scores for all the ones before that are, they're definitely like the score for Mrs. Wardh I find super haunting, but it's mostly just like an organ and someone like sort of singing, not words.
Yeah, it's very cool, very effective.
Have either of you seen Mozart is a Murderer? I think that's his last giallo movie. It's from the 90s. That one we see him kind of returning to
I missed that one.
Kind of like conventional, non kind of mystical style. It's almost like he's responding to how far off the rails like Argento and Fulci had gone by that point. And he's like, all right, let's bring it back to we're just at a conservatory. There's nothing like mystical happening. It's just a murderer.
Guy has gloves. He kills some people.
Yeah. Right. As crazy as that gets is like flashbacks and stuff. That really kind of like roots itself in like psychology more than in anything like mystical. But yeah, no, I love that about Martino, and I've yet to see any of his westerns or he's got some action
war
movies that don't kind of like comfortably fit. I've seen Casablanca Express. Is awesome.
Is it?
It's on Tubi. Very fun.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I'm gonna watch that one.
I will say, so many gialli have scenes that just in my head kind of run together as one. But
sure.
I will say Martino, it's kind of just like you can just be like, oh, the swamp scene. It's like, yeah, torso. It's just he has a few scenes that are just so just creepy and out there that you're not mixing them up with anyone else.
Which is also a little striking in that, because I watched all these movies 2.5 months ago now, and then like I sort of reviewed a few of them that I wanted to, but even thinking back, one of the things that I think is charming about watching a bunch of his movies in a run is that he has sort of he has a cast that just recurs everywhere, right? There's 4 or 5 people, like Edwige Fenech. I'm going to say all their names in insane ways, probably. I should have written down their names. But there's the guy who plays Jean in Mrs. Wardh shows up in a couple. The guy who plays her husband in Mrs. Wardh shows up in a couple. The lady who plays her best friend in Mrs. Wardh shows up in a couple. She's a major character in Torso. I think a few of them are in Torso. But even though these characters are like bipping around and showing up in all of the other movies, they still don't really run together in my head. I still like, even thinking about them a month and a half later or whatever, I'm like, oh, this is distinctly Your Vice's Locked Room, or like this one is definitely Torso.
I think it's because he carefully deploys the dreamlike logic in comparison to like other directors. Like he's really careful about when he mixes things up and sort of like intentionally tries to like confuse you.
Yeah. There's a distinctness to them.
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny that like Argento is the one we associate with Hitchcock, whereas I think like, I don't know, there's much more of like you feel like you're in the hands of a master with the great Martino movies. Yeah. You really feel like you're like going on a ride,
So this Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh was Martino's first giallo film. We've talked about some of the other genres he'd worked in, including comedies. I don't know if we've really touched on that yet, but he'd done some documentaries, spaghetti westerns.
Yeah.
What do you feel his work in these other genres brings to his films?
That's a good question. I think he is he comes off it as a just sort of competent director. He has a really good sense of shots and of timing. Yeah. It may be that if you came into gialli initially, you would be like, I can do anything, and therefore I will make any decision. But coming in from a world of more sort of traditionally oriented structures, right? His films are very... we've already sort of said this, but they're very sort of strong and easy to follow. And like Mrs. Wardh has 6 twists, I think, at the end. I didn't count them, but it feels like a lot, right? And that itself kind of, to me, feels a little... It reminded me of like in high school sneaking out and watching Wild Things. It feels like a much more modern way to structure a movie, to be like twist, extra twist, third twist, fifth twist, right? But it's very concrete.
I would echo that. I think experience in other genres just sort of gave him the competence. He knows where to put the camera. I don't know. I hate to keep calling him like more of like a conventionally minded filmmaker, but like, I don't know. It's clear that it's like, I don't know. You kind of could have put him in any genre, and I bet Martino would have made
a banger
excellent entertainment. Yeah.
Well, Jim, this reminds me, when we talked about Tobe Hooper, you said he was a director who, when given a script, like, he's just going to direct the shit out of it, I think was your direct quote.
Yeah, Martino, I think, is the same, right? He's although he wrote most of these also. Yeah. So he's kind of coming in from all directions. One of the things that Tobe Hooper does is, like, he pushes everything. I would say more towards the Argento end of things, right? Where he's going to be like, how can I milk the most juice out of every single word? Whereas Martino feels a little bit more Spartan. These movies all, to me, feel sort of thin, right? They're like thin and like a little nasty. There isn't like extra stuff on them. He's not using colors if he doesn't have to use colors. They're very kind of stripped back, which is the opposite of what I'm usually looking for in movies. But I found them You know what it is? It's because often, this goes back to Ron Howard, often when people are trying to do sort of the basic steps, they hit the basic steps and everything's fine. But Martino he's hitting just kind of basic moves, but he's hitting them all with such precision that they all just feel super correct. And there is still a lot of like lurid nastiness because they're gialli.
Yeah, right. The juxtaposition of like coyness with like the most lurid nastiness in the world is pretty perfectly captured in Slave of the Cannibal God.
Sure.
I don't want to like spoil too much about like the final sequence, but I'll talk when we get there about like a shot to shot transition that's like, whoa, holy moly.
It catches you off guard.
But just to sort of conclude the idea of his like professionalism, you noted this, Jim, like the fact that he's like such a competent, like clean director almost makes Slave of the Cannibal God feel more like lurid.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like you are watching a super professional documentary crew come look at this or something. Or it's like you're watching, like, we brought a Hollywood crew out to follow this instead of the sort of like handheld feel of, you know, Cannibal Ferox or something.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of, you know, cannibal movies have like a pretense to like documentary realism. And this sort of does with that opening title card.
Yeah, but not really. It doesn't play
really
the same.
feels much
it's not
more
like
polished.
What Cannibal Holocaust, right? Where they include a bunch of like actual war footage. They put in like they use real documentary footage to sort of cue it up, and then it's all shot like a documentary, and it just feels grimy, right? And yeah, you're right. Mountain of the Cannibal God it feels much slicker. Which then when dudes like cut an iguana open and drink its blood, you're like, oh, this feels somehow worse.
It's so much worse
that.
to take this like very seriously.
Yeah.
So in Strange Vice, Edwige Fenech plays Julie Wardh, and she is one of Martino's most used actors. She plays a diplomat's wife who, as you may have guessed, has a strange vice, and it's beginning to follow her around and torment her. Jim, you want to take it from there?
Sure, yeah. It is in many ways sort of a straightforward, though twisty, giallo. This is sort of what's at the core of the movie, right? I don't know how deep to go into this before we tell you what the plot is, but I'm going to start here, which is that it's in the title, right? The Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh. She is in this sort of cold, loveless, sexless marriage. And part of the reason she is because she's running away from this dude, Jean, with whom she had a very passionate relationship. And the way that this is played out is she's like, oh, he's a pervert and a sex maniac, and he could be doing the murders, right? There are murders happening. The murderer is also a sex fiend. The murderer is, what do they call him? Yeah, they call him
the sex pervert.
They say sex fiend and sex pervert.
There's a quote at the beginning where they talk to a cop, and they're like, there was a murder, and they're like, oh, was it the sex fiend?
Was it the sex fiend?
And the cop
I love
says,
that that's just at the
yes,
tip of their tongue.
And he's still using the razor. Like, that's information that police would give out. We all know he's slitting throats with a razor. But yeah, there's a guy who's like murdering women. He's a sex pervert, and he's killing women with a straight razor. And so she thinks, well, maybe it's this guy. We see both of them interacting during the movie. He keeps sending her flowers with things that say like cards that say things like, the worst part of you is the best thing you've got, and your vice is a locked room and only I have the key, famously. But we also see flashbacks to their relationship, right? And it feels like she sort of implies that he's like a maniac and that she always felt scared with him. But every time we see them interacting, it feels like they're having consensual S&M sex. There's like a scene where he dumps a bottle of liquor on her, I assume it's liquor, and then smashes the bottle and slices her clothes open with it. And then they're like rolling around in the dirt. And there's one where they're like running through the rain, and then he like hits her, and then they're having sex on the ground.
Oh my god, I was watching that on the train today. Holy moly! Not a film to be watched in public, folks.
No, it's like they're doing like some pretty intense S&M stuff. Well, decently intense S&M stuff. But it also, when we see it always feels sort of consensual, and also the title sort of implies that it is consensual. And so it's an interesting, I don't know, I like the way that it's playing with that, where it feels like the thing that scares her is her own attraction to this dangerousness. And then we sort of also see that play out in real time, where she has this very cold marriage. And then she meets a guy at a party named George, who he and his sister they've just inherited a bunch of money. And he starts to court her. He wants to court her in front of her husband. think I wrote down that quote also, where he's like, my specialty is courting women in front of their husbands, which is weird. Everyone in this movie is a little weird. But then he's like super handsome and there, and she has no interest in him until he sort of forces her to go on a motorcycle ride and makes her feel uncomfortable and scared and in danger on the motorcycle. And then she's like, oh, I like this, George, right? So we sort of watch this masochism thing playing out in real time. Which I think that whole sort of back and forth about this idea around her being scared of her own sexuality is a fascinating element of the film. But then then we sort of continue through and we think that maybe Jean is doing murders until an hour into the movie when the murderer gets killed, which is our first major twist, right? We're sort of following through this journey, and we're running away, and she goes to Spain with George after George's sister gets mysteriously murdered by the sex pest, and then am I telling this in a satisfactory way? And
covering a lot of ground.
And then the murderer gets murdered. And then we're sort of left super up in the air.
It throws twists at you, just so many at the end.
I love a composition style that he sort of returns to in both of these movies. He loves putting our characters like sort of deep in the frame, even in sequences where it really like almost makes no sense. I think of in like Slave of the Cannibal Gods, and they're getting like kicked out of the camp. We get a shot of the guy yelling at them, like Father Mosaius.
Yeah.
We cut to them all super, super deep in the frame as if to communicate this sort of like isolation. And we get a lot of shots of Edwige Fenech, like deep in the frame. The lighting in this movie is incredible, and it's so not the stereotypical giallo look. I don't know. I feel like when we think of giallo, we think of kind of like what an Argento film looks like, and it really has its own aesthetic,
and it is still like sort of stark and striking. It's not like very naturalistic most of the time, but it is but it's very, very different than like an Argento sort of imaginary world.
Those stark compositions, oftentimes like isolated characters, again like deep in the frame. And I love the twist on top of twist. There's nothing better to me than introducing like a twist like an hour in and then introducing two more. It's very in keeping with the style of filmmaking perfected in the Saw cycle of films between 2005 and 2010.
I thought we were done with those, Bennett.
Sorry. No, I watched like 3 of them last night.
Oh no.
My friends had never seen them. I don't know.
So we sort of find out that Jean wasn't the killer because the killer gets killed, and Jean is still around. Oh, and we thought maybe they were followed to Spain by the murderer, but then clearly not. And then we see, once we sort of learned that the killer isn't Jean, almost immediately Jean shows up at their apartment in Spain, where Mrs. Wardh and George, her courter. Is that a word? Courtesan? Is that it?
Suitor? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, let's go with suitor.
Suitor, yeah. Gentleman caller.
Gentleman caller. They're staying at this place in Spain, and so Jean shows up and is like, now I'm the murderer, and cuts the gas. And really cleverly, they have a door that latches with like, one of those, like a bolt, like a physical bolt you drop into a slot, and he like sneaks out the door and puts a piece of ice under it. So the ice will melt and then the bolt will lock, so it'll look locked from the inside, which is genius.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it's never come up in another movie. I've never seen another character do that.
Yeah, it's real good murderer stuff.
You know what? I think it really speaks to Martino's genius, a move like that. And it's so incredible that he, of all people, would come up with that like genius tactic for a killer. Which
maybe, to call back to what you were mentioning earlier, Craig, maybe it does sort of come from his like worldly experience of directing a million kinds of films, right? He's like sometimes doing a giallo, but sometimes doing like a crime film, right? And maybe that's a thing that he came up with or came across at some point while dealing with like normal or crime.
Right, yeah. Instead of getting caught in like certain types of like genre trappings, he has this sort of bigger library to call from for sort of like moves a character might make, or like even
instead of being
moves.
Like, and then maggots fell from the ceiling, right? He's like, and then here's a clever way someone could make it look like somebody committed suicide. It's just a very different approach to what a giallo can be. Giallo.
He has attention to like worldly details that the more mystical filmmakers sometimes forget about.
Yeah, they don't look small enough. Yeah, so we find out that Jean is doing a murder, and then she's dead, and then our main character's dead, and so we sort of follow what Jean shows up in a grove, and George shows up, and it turns out that George is paying Jean to murder Mrs. Wardh, which doesn't make any sense until then. Jean goes and meets up with Mrs. Ward's husband, and we find out that the whole movie has been Strangers on a Train, but from the underside, where these two men met up, and one of them murdered the other one's sister so that he could get a full inheritance, and the other one murdered the first one's wife so that he could get a life insurance. And then they're driving away together, giddily laughing when they see Mrs. Wardh on the side of the road and freak out. And then some cops start, which is an insane way for the police to be like, this is how we're going to entrap them. We're going to put the woman that they tried to murder on the side of the road, and then they'll see her and they'll freak out, and then we'll roll up.
You'll be super safe.
Yeah, right? It'll be fine for her. Don't worry about it. But that's what they do. And then the guys drive into a river and die.
The scene is perfectly directed, though, because like we don't go back with Mrs. Wardh once they've seen her. Like it's left as like a maybe sort of a thing, which is so great. But like the most, not to be the cinema sense guy, but just the most insane thing movie cops have ever cooked up. Like, we'll just hope they just see her in passing and don't hit her with their car or something.
And don't just not notice her at all.
Yeah, right. They have to stop and like come back.
Yeah,
yeah.
But it works, and then they die. Everybody dies. And she goes off with a young doctor, because everyone in Italian movies is constantly falling in love. So she goes off with her fourth suitor of the movie, who is just a cop, some cop who showed up. Oh, it's the doctor. It's the doctor that saved her. Right, because we find out that she didn't actually die. She would have died, except George showed up slightly too early. If he had waited another 10 minutes to show up and open the door, she would be dead. But he showed up and acted traumatized too early. And now she's fine. And in love with a young doctor. And presumably rich.
So one scene that I do think really shows everything that Martino is great at is when her friend Carol thinks it's all a game and she goes to meet the killer in the park because she's been blackmailed. And she's like, I'll go. But when she arrives, the park is just, everything is silent. And I just, the way that scene...
And huge bushes, just giant bushes and silence.
And the wind just starts blowing and the sound just like slowly comes in. And it's like, at first it seems like nothing's going to happen, but...
And it's in a lot of... It's super sparse, right? It's a very weird, empty space. We also are cutting back and forth, at least at first, between Carol and Julie, who's watching a motorcycle race on TV for whatever reason. And it's sort of just her being distraught watching this motorcycle race because she knows that her friend is off potentially getting murdered. And Carol is sort of carefree walking through these weird silent gardens. And we get a couple of like little mini jump scares, right? She sort of comes across a garden caretaker and it's like, oh, but then the caretaker is just like, they're closing the garden
It's
soon.
Closing time, so it's sort of ominous. Yeah, she might get locked in.
Yeah. This is also a movie where, sorry, I'm sidetracking myself, where all of the spaces are super like 70s Italy luscious, right? Like everything has crazy, beautiful wallpaper, and they have the room where her TV is. It's like a space age TV and a couch that covers 3/4 of the walls. But it's all one couch, right? Everything is just these like gorgeous sort of spacey. Their doors have bubbly windows in them. And so she's in this like space room, just alone and tiny, while her friend is sort of walking through these gardens. And we're tracking with her, and it feels sort of silent and empty and strange. And she also, Carol, goes through the scene sort of from being confident that she's going to run into Jean and laugh in his face to just from the absence of anything, just sort of terrified. She's like, I don't understand what's happening here. I thought I was just going to run into this guy I know and laugh at him. But now nothing is happening. And it goes on for kind of a long time, but not like in a incompetent way, like in a very...
No, in like a cat like fucking with a mouse sort of way.
Yes.
Like, yeah, it feels very like Martino sort of playing with us, and it's like scary and
it is scary.
And really tense. And I don't know, again, like you don't often think of like these giallo films as being all that like authentically scary.
Yeah.
They're often like really unsettling, but they rarely like I don't know. I feel like they rarely play on like tension and fear in that like conventional way. And here I am again saying conventional. But I mean it as a compliment when I'm talking about Martino. You
mentioned earlier that Martino is sort of, we don't say this, but he's sort of the Hitchcockiest, right? And this whole sequence is very Hitchcocky. This could absolutely be in Vertigo or something, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess it just, speaks to the degree to which he's an auteur, that he wrote his own scripts. But like, I almost wish he had been a guy that was like a journeyman, just kind of handed like shitty scripts, because one imagines he's so good that like he could have kind of like made hay out of anything. He could have like adapted bestsellers or...
This scene could have been like a terrible 3-line thing where like a lesser filmmaker would have made a terrible, like she walks into the hedges and gets murdered.
Yeah. That's what it seems like when the caretaker comes out. It's like, oh, this is over.
Yeah.
You know? But that suspense remains.
And he really makes a meal out
This
of
film
it.
could be really bad. I mean, like dream
Yeah.
sequences in horror movies are so often so bad.
Yes.
And I don't know, a lot of like bad gialli, like, you know, lean into the dreamlike logic as a way of just obscuring the fact that the filmmaker isn't any good. And those are oftentimes great to watch. But like the dream sequence in this film, when like the three like men are all sort of like overlapping with one another, it really, really quite effective.
Yeah.
You know, one of the most, I would say, I don't know, accurate evocations of what it is like to be kind of like in a dream and actually experiencing dreamlike logic. You know, because we say dreamlike logic all the time when we're talking about movies, and really we just mean incoherence.
Yeah. We mean, we threw
actually,
some nonsense together.
Yeah. That actually felt like bringing a dream to life.
Can I just mention one shot that really struck me when I was sort of rewatching the other day is because it is so mostly shot in such a sort of straightforward but competent way. There's a shot that really, when she's sort of in Spain freaking out that she's maybe being followed by a murderer again, there's a scene where the camera just starts swinging back and forth, like someone on the tripod is just ringing it back and forth, and it's so disorienting and sort of out of the general vernacular of the film that it's like a goofy move, but was for me at least surprisingly worked pretty well. I was like, whoa, I got a little like seasick.
I also love the part with the harpoon. They just like shoot a harpoon at her, and she's like, "Oh, that was weird," and runs away.
Yeah. End of moment.
So yeah, Martino, he's got some pretty gory scenes, but I found an interview with him where he said they would intentionally go overboard with some of the fantasy and violent scenes just so the Italian censors would have something obvious to cut out. And
that's
he
funny.
said through that they'd have, you know, this really terrible thing, and then the rest would seem more tame by comparison. So Jim, I'm just curious because you've directed some films that, you know, fall a little bit outside of convention.
Sure.
But how do you strike the balance of, you know, putting your vision forward while also delivering a product that the people with money and, you know, have the final approval can sign off on?
I mean, if I knew that, I'd have made way more movies.
Fair. Okay.
I don't know. It's I imagine I've obviously never had to deal with like the MPAA because I'm not on that scale, and I don't believe in them. I think I've heard other people sort of mention a similar practice, right? Where you're like, I'm going to put in a few things that are just too much, so that when they come at me, I can be like, I'll compromise with you and take those things out. Which I think that's like basically how you like negotiate for a car, right? Where you're like, I'm going to say $3,000 less than I want to pay. It's a fun tactic, but also a dumb thing that we have to do in order to navigate systems. But it's also, I don't know. I'm curious, and there's no way to know this, I guess. But I'm curious for someone like Martino, what then, if you're like, I'm going to put in this one super gnarly scene because I want them to be like, ooh, we have to take out that one scene, and then I'll have the movie I want. What if you then send it to the censors and they're like, yeah, seems okay.
Yeah.
Are you like, well, I'm going to take this one scene out anyway? Or are you like, I guess my movie's just grosser than I wanted it to be?
That's an even better question. I don't know.
Is he still alive? Can we find? Because
He
also,
is, yeah.
inevitably, like, if it does get cut out, then 20 years later, some company is going to find it somewhere and be like, we have the original cut. This is Martino's intended cut. And he'll be like, wait, no, I didn't. My intended cut was the compromise that I made.
I shot that horrifying scene as like, as a joke, basically.
Yeah.
As a troll.
Yeah. I just wanted to gross out the censors. Please don't put it in my movie. That's like the plot of a metatextual, like a Berberian sound system, like someone who made a bunch of movies, and now all their movies are being restored, but with scenes they never wanted in them. And they're like,
and has to defend like director's cuts that like have no connection to what they actually envisioned.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. I'm gonna steal that.
Take it. And then somehow that turns into someone doing like copycat murders of their grossest scenes.
Exactly.
Or something.
Yeah. There's some sort of elaborate traps, of course.
Yeah.
We've touched on this in the past 2 episodes, but the largest complaint you often see with giallo films is that people say these films are terrible to women. And I mean, it's not wrong, but I think, especially with Martino's films, the criticism just so often ignores that the men in these films are just absolutely monstrous and like cartoonishly detestable. I mean, why do you think Martino stuffs his films with so many unlikable characters who are all trying to seem nice?
I think honestly, if you asked him, Martino would probably say his films. Well, I don't want to put this in his mouth, but like, I don't imagine Martino thinks of himself as a guy with any like problems with women. I think he probably thinks of his films as like having like a broadly feminist message in general, at least the ones that like focus on women and feature horrible men. I think part of his men being so categorically horrific is, you know, part of creating a world that's fundamentally misogynistic, and that is, you know, female characters are going to have to be sort of fighting against, you know, they're going to be like at a disadvantage. They'll be that kind of like lone figure sort of deep in the frame against a world that we can understand is populated by and large with, you know, people who are bad and are deceitful in particular. You know, all the twists I think speak to all the twists and the abundance of, you know, nice guys really I think speaks to his interest in creating a world that is working against his protagonists.
It does feel like Julie Wardh, as I mentioned at the beginning, it feels like she has a fear of her own sexual proclivities, but beyond that she seems like a healthy decent human being, right? But literally everyone around her, it's just her sort of trying to get through life, and literally everyone she runs into is an absolute monster. It to the point where at the end she's like starts to drive off with this handsome young doctor, and you're like, please don't.
He's smirking. What? Why?
Yeah.
Right, and I don't think the film wants us to believe. I don't think Martino or the film wants us to believe that there's anything bad about the quote-unquote strange vice in and of itself. Like, there's nothing bad about the fact that she's a woman who enjoys sex. It's just that a world has impressed upon her that that's bad, and also most of the men she's surrounded by are, you know, sexual predators. Yeah. So it's sort of a world exists where it's tough to have a vice as strange as hers. And
Jean sort of comes off as the least awful of all of them. Jean, who is the former S&M partner,
isn't of itself sort of problematic, right? The one that, like, from the beginning she's telling us is this horrifying sex pervert is he's the least problematic.
He's a photographer and he has a bunch of pets. And he eventually gets paid a bunch of money by one of these two dudes to try to murder her, right? The only time he like actually tries to hurt someone in a non-consensual way is when he's being paid a great sum of money, which isn't great, right? That's still not a great human trait to have. But everyone else is trying to murder her out of their own free will, right? So he's less bad than all of them. But we even get a scene where it's like a cop interrogating the two of them, and they're sort of talking back and forth about their kink, and at the end of the thing, the cop is like, "Oh, I don't approve of y'all's sexual practice." I made him Texan. I don't approve of y'all's sexual proclivities. And Jean is like, "I don't care. Deal with it." Yeah. And you're like, "Oh, he's sort of like the only one in this movie who is like free until eventually he then becomes a murderer." But yeah, it feels like it's not kink shaming really at all. It's just sort of set in a world where that cop is the norm, right? Where it is considered bad for a woman to be probably interested in sex at all, but certainly interested in sort of kinky stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, this is like gonna sound like small praise or something, but like in the world of like horrors that are leveled against the protagonists of horror movies, I feel like, I don't know, Mrs. Wardh is not like made to suffer. She's like stalked a lot throughout this movie, but there's not a lot of like torture and stuff that's like that she's like forced to endure for our like viewing pleasure. Even like the ultimate like murder that happens is a fairly like hands-off style of murder. Yeah, she just lies on the floor and quietly carbon monoxide or
It's not like a Saw movie or something.
It's not like our classic that classic series. It's not like that classic Jigsaw killer we've come to know and love. No, I liked your use of the phrase "sexual proclivities" because there's a lot of like very like artfully clunky dialogue late in the film, especially like when the doctor is like trying to like see to her after the asphyxiation. He says something like, "I cannot sense her pulse. Phone the authorities immediately," or something like that, which I really liked.
Do you guys have any final thoughts on Strange Vice before we move on to Mountain of the Cannibal God? Or
I'll just say, it's as good or better than a lot of the gialli you've heard of, or that get more ink and more discussion.
Yeah.
Like all of Martino's explorations in the genre in the 70s and 80s, it's really great.
Yeah, I would say if people are like looking to this episode of Split Picks for an actual recommendation, which I hope they are, I hope that's why they tune in, and also to hear your thoughts and voices. Yours specifically, not mine. Any of Martino's outings is a fully worthwhile use of your time. I think they are all lesser seen than the like I said at the beginning, right? The ones that are like really like hooping and hollering, but they are all the better sort of for their lack of those wildnesses. And really, they're all super, super solid. I could have picked any of them and come in here and try to defend it, I think. If you want to watch the most sleazy, Torso is the way to go. I think if you want to watch something that's the most Argento, Scorpion with Two Tails is the way to go. But I think that these early 70s ones are really sort of where the joy mostly is. And I think Mrs. Wardh is a really, really incredible example of just a rock-solid giallo.
Yeah. Yeah, and even more so than Fulci, dipping into Martino's films gives you the sense of discovery that Argento's films, and then, obviously the big American horror directors aren't necessarily going to give you. So just type his name into Tubi, folks, and enjoy the ride. It's my Peter Travers-esque recommendation.
I have one more sort of final giallo note, which is because when I was watching all these movies, so I'm never going to stop recording this episode. When we were watching all these movies, I went out and bought this.
I kept thinking about doing it, but I hate scotch so much.
This is a bottle of J&B, rare J&B blended scotch. Yeah. Because it's in every Italian movie from the 70s, but absolutely every giallo.
Have you seen the supercut?
No.
There's a great supercut of all the giallos that have J&B.
It floating by in the background and then someone taking a slug of it. I bought this because I was like, I'm watching all of these and I should know. It's bad. It's bad scotch. But it's a gorgeous bottle. And so that maybe that's why. Because it's so beautiful to look at, but it's a bad scotch.
It's funny, like you watch or read stuff that's like set in like the 60s or 70s, and like people order it like it's the good scotch.
Yeah,
like Smirnoff was treated in like the 60s. It's so weird.
Did they just not have good scotch yet?
Truman Capote apparently loved J&B. It would insist on ordering it as Justerini and Brooks or whatever it is.
What a dork!
It's so funny to think of like such a dork and such a snob as drinking like horrible scotch.
Yeah. I mean, I went through my whole bottle eventually, but it's a chore.
Yeah, I was gonna get one just to hide on my bookshelf in the back for this episode.
See, that's nice. Yeah. I thought about doing that, but I also teach college classes in this room, and I didn't want my students to be like, "Oh, he's an alcoholic now."
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's probably a good place to take a break. We'll be back in a minute. We're going to talk about either the Mountain or the Slave of the Cannibal God.
But which one?
Pick your title. It's they both work. All right, we'll be right back.
Is that the one with the karate?
What?
I have completely forgotten what a Stephen King movie is.
Hi, I'm Sam Hain. Come on down to the used pumpkin mart.
Synesthesia, a movie podcast with Jason Michaelich and Jim Hickcox.
It's time again.
From Split Tooth Media.
Italy had a trend of cannibal films in the 70s and 80s. Can either of you begin to describe the fascination with this trend?
I think it grew out of Mondo movies.
Mm-hmm. And do you want to explain what that is?
Yeah, Jim, you want to, for the benefit of our listeners?
There was a whole trend of what Mondo Canna is the first one, or like the most famous first one, A Dog's World. I'm sure I said Canna wrong. I always read it as Mondo Cane. It's spelled like Cane.
I think it's Kane.
Kane? Mondo Cane. But it's a whole world of movies that sort of grow out of that they call them Mondo, which is just like world, right? But they're exploitation films, but they're documentaries. They would just send people to countries that were less developed. Is that a rude thing to say? I think that's just accurate, right? Less industrialized.
Industrialized, yeah.
And be like, look what these people do. These people, I don't know, eat a coconut and then kill a dog, right? They would just find the kind of gnarliest things that they could in other societies and then make like documentaries. There were quotes around that if you couldn't hear them, that sort of are documentary, but largely are just exploitative. They're just for you to watch films, things happen. It's like when you're in 5th grade and you flip through National Geographic to find boobs. It's that, but a whole movie and a whole genre of movies, right? So I feel like the cannibal movies sort of grew out of that.
Yeah, so it started with movies that were reappropriating documentary footage for exploitation films, and then it sort of evolved into exploitation films that were pretending to be documentaries. Oftentimes, yeah. I've avoided most of the canonical, really all of the canonical cannibal films on reputation alone: Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, etc. But I know Cannibal Holocaust, at least, it's like an early found footage film. It professes to be like, what was left behind by this documentary crew that
Yeah,
got eaten.
It literally uses the same structure, right? They're like, this documentary crew went to document these cannibals, and half of them don't believe they're cannibals, but then someone else found footage is basically just the mockumentary of the horror world, right? It's inevitably someone shot some stuff and then we found it and they're all dead. But yeah, they're exactly that. They're early versions of that.
Like the only cannibal film I've seen, and it's really like a zombie film, is Dr. Cannibal MD, I think also called Cannibal Holocaust, which was introduced at the screening I saw it at as probably the only cannibal film without animal cruelty. So, we're already sort of wading into, why this is a difficult subgenre to talk about, because it features kind of a soup of problematic topics. There's a lot of animal cruelty. There's a lot of racism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of xenophobia, just sort of like fear of different cultures. There's, a lot of violence against women, sometimes violence against children. It's like I said, a soup of problematizing aspects, for sure.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because normally we kind of work up to some of the more problematic elements of the film, but you again chose a bold film. I think it is important to kind of touch on this stuff before we get too deep into this one.
Well, it's also, those are just the hallmarks of the tradition, right? The things that you are doing, if you're an Italian director in 1970, whatever, and you're making a cannibal movie, is you're like, well, I have to find brown people and say that they're from some weird island and make them dress up dumb, and I have to mutilate some real animals. Those are
gotta be a sacrifice.
Those are things that you are signing on to by putting cannibal in the title, right?
Do you want to just give us a little background on what this film is about and why you feel it's worth discussing, despite its more controversial aspects?
Sure. So, for me, like I said, kind of up top, like I wanted to pick a film of Martino's that wasn't a gialli. I wanted to kind of look outside that world. And, one of the things that makes him so interesting is that he played in a lot of the subgenres we associate with Italian films. And, this is one of them, the cannibal film. And watching this, I was really struck by how kind of confidently made it is. It's just kind of like a rock solid movie that happens to have some of the most upsetting nature footage and really problematic footage of, and I'm using air quotes here, folks, natives you've ever seen in a movie. So I certainly don't bring this to the table as a way of like recommending it for like everybody, but if you are at all a fan of like exploitation films, if you know you're comfortable with what you're kind of necessarily getting into with a film like this, then I do recommend it, because I don't know, it's hard to believe that even the canonical films of this subgenre are better than this. I mean, I think when people talk about Cannibal Holocaust, they mostly talk about the score, right? I don't think anyone thinks of it as being like an especially great piece of filmmaking. Whereas I think this is pretty good.
I think Cannibal Holocaust is mostly striking in that it's sort of the earliest one that we talk about, right? It's one of the progenitors of the genre, and it does some gnarly stuff, right? It has documentary footage in it. It has real war footage. Like, you watch actual human beings die, and then you watch a guy stab a turtle, and then nothing about it is good to watch, right? It's like one of those things where like you watch it and then you can be like, I have watched that. The thing that is great about this movie is that you can watch it and also be like, plus I got some cinematic joy from it.
There's something doubly subversive about a film like this that has some polish to it and has like a Bond girl and like Stacey Keach in it. I also think, we should say like the influence of these films is so vast, and so its tropes are so ubiquitous that like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom does not happen without Italian cannibal films.
Absolutely.
You don't have again, like a quote unquote Indian guy pulling a guy's heart out and doing this if you don't have all of these people who are allegedly from like Papua New Guinea or what have you, like sacrificing animals and stuff, these made up religions.
Yeah.
So, the movie idea of sort of native cultures that this is playing with is, we should, of course, preface it with like very problematic. We certainly don't condone any of this, but like, you got to acknowledge how huge its influence was on the most mainstream of mainstream films.
Val, give me a little bit of the plot.
So Ursula Andress, who you'll all remember from Dr. No, is a woman named Susan whose husband is an anthropologist who's gone missing somewhere out in New Guinea. As a very, very self-serious title card tells us, this is one of the few places in the world that's really untouched by the West, untouched by modern technology. So she goes out there with her brother, and a sort of Indiana Jones adventuring professor type, Edward Foster, played by the great Stacey Keach.
Can I just mention the way that we meet Stacey Keach? It's like, what, 6 or 7 minutes into the movie, and they're like, oh, we have to go meet this guy in his house, and it's like a weird dilapidated house, and we see Stacey Keach before they do, and he just kind of enters into the frame and like violently leers at them for 6 or 8 seconds, and then like breaks into like a happy smile and is like, hey guys, nice to see you. But he like really enters the movie on like a boat of doom.
He's also wearing shorts.
He's wearing tiny shorts, which you don't see until we cut to a wide shot. It's cut into the movie like a gag.
Mm-hmm. And then he has a good line about the dilapidated house too. He says something like, "Oh, you must forgive the informality of my home."
Yeah.
We also get, I should say, just some great like stock nature footage. Like right from the start, we're getting like the violence of nature, as violent as it gets. We see like a turtle attack an alligator.
Yeah.
He really is making a meal of like what nature footage he got right from that title sequence or the opening credits. But yeah, they go out there in hopes of finding her brother. They believe there's like a cursed mountain where he may have disappeared at the hands of a tribe. And eventually they meet up with a guy named Manolo, who is like an adventurer who's been living out there with a priest, Father, I want to say like Mosaius.
Yeah.
And let's just say they run afoul of the natives and several creatures and critters, many of whom meet ignominious ends.
Well, Mosaius, right, is also, he's living with like a tribe. I'm putting that in quotes. I'm putting
he's
everything
sort of like
racist in quotes.
Missionary doctor. He's got sort of like a, I don't know. He's your stock sort of guy who's kind of gone native.
Yeah, like Dr. Livingston, right? And he's like sort of our white touch point in this culture. But so we meet like the tribe, right? And we're like, oh, they're okay people. But then while we're there hanging out in that camp, Stacey Keach reveals that he was kidnapped by a different tribe. And was made to also become a cannibal, and tells it in a way where it was clearly to him very harrowing, right? This like experience of being forced to eat human flesh.
No, he gets like his Robert Shaw
Yeah.
from like Jaws moment.
Yeah. But that sort of keys us into the other curse of the mountain beyond it just being cursed, is that it's full of cannibals.
This movie kind of has a few acts to it. It kind of starts as like they arrive at the island, but then it becomes a jungle adventure movie, and they kind of stop at these various camps, and there's a waterfall.
Yeah, kill
scene.
a tarantula.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about the structure of this movie? It's a fairly straightforward narrative, but I feel like it does some interesting things.
I like the way this sort of like travel montage is handled. I think that's like really good. You get some great photography, and it's also like, I don't know, you get like funny like bits of like comedy, like the guy eating the crab is sort of like played for laughs. No, I like the structure of this movie. I like the whole travel sequence is like kind of just extended enough and leaves us enough time for a really pretty harrowing climax. We should mention along the way they kill a tarantula, which inspires their sort of native guides to sacrifice a Komodo dragon.
Yeah, which is not great.
The requisite scene of animal cruelty. Not great. I realized watching this that I think like one of the reasons that I sort of like it is one of the first favorite movies I can remember is 2005's Peter Jackson's King Kong sticking out to me. I don't know. I think there's just something about the people being like stuck in the jungle and like attacked by like critters that appeals to me.
I wrote down after the first time I watched this, I was like, the first 75 minutes of this was like a rad, fun journey. And then the last half an hour was really, I kept thinking it was going to end and wanting it to end. But then when
it goes on for so long.
When I like re-went through it yesterday, and I was like, oh, that's because the first 75 minutes is before they're abducted by a cannibal tribe. And that part of the movie is like, it's kind of a fun, except for like the part where we're watching animals be murdered. It's a pretty fun movie.
Yeah, honestly, post that, like once they've been kicked out of Dr. Mosaius's camp, it becomes for like a brief interlude, kind of this like affable sort of like fish out of water, travelogue. They're just sort of like dealing with the elements, the best they can. Yeah. And then Stacey Keach gets killed.
Know each other, yeah.
Like surprisingly, something this has in common with Joy's is I think we do see him sort of just like floating in water at one point, much like many of the victims in Joy's. He gets just sort of unceremoniously killed.
Yeah. He just kind of flops off because we find out that he's primarily there to murder the rest of this tribe.
Yeah, he wants to exterminate the tribe.
it.
Right. We should say we find out that everyone has
a motive.
motives.
Yeah.
They have no interest in finding her husband. They're there to like steal like uranium that they think is deposited in the mountain,
which is the curse of the mountain, right?
Not to be the CinemaSins guy, but they're just like playing around with this like solid uranium with their hands. How are you going to bring that back and not, I don't know,
die?
Have, tumors like hanging off of your body? I don't understand. Like,
yeah, it seems like they maybe don't totally understand cancer and stuff. But they do have a Geiger counter. They're looking for it. And then, I don't want to give anything away.
We can get to the actual mountain. But.
Yeah, speaking of the Geiger counter, basically we get to this cannibalistic tribe that kidnaps them, and we find out that her husband's like putrefacting corpse with like a Geiger counter stuck to it, which they are taking to be like the beating of a heart, is now being worshipped like a god. And this is Martino at his most Fulci-esque, when they're like smearing corpse juice on everybody.
Because he's melted. He's melted from also presumably carrying around chunks of uranium, right? The radioactivity has made him into a like human-shaped blob. With a Geiger counter like just shoved, like easily slid into the middle of his torso like he was warm butter.
It's pretty repulsive.
And then the rituals that we see escalate pretty quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so folks, again, turn off the podcast now if you don't want to hear some descriptions of some pretty harrowing stuff. But I alluded before to the way Martino in this sequence sort of at first is like kind of playing it really coy and then is just like, well, here it is, folks. So we see a woman like masturbating, and it's played like kind of coy. We keep like cutting back to her. She's just sort of like feeling herself. And then as we finally get a shot of sort of like penetration, we then cut to a man having sex with a pig. Again, I'm sorry, folks, that I have to describe this. It's really him just like I don't know, lulling us into a sense that we're going to see like a slow escalation to something, and then being like, boom, here it is, folks. The most upsetting thing you've maybe ever seen in a film. Shot for, again, the sequence goes on for a long time. It really is like, to me, like, I don't know, it feels like it must be like the apotheosis of what we think of like the subgenre as being. Like, I know there's obviously films with like more infamous instances of animal cruelty or more iconic deaths, but like it's hard to imagine a like ritual sacrifice sort of sequence with more upsetting imagery and like a more just genuinely unsettling vibe than this.
I don't think in the real world that man is having sex with that pig.
No, I don't. Yeah,
I think that man
is
he's thrusting his hips near the back of a pig. Within the world of the film, you are watching a man have sex with. It's only important to note this in the context of movies like this, where they are sometimes slicing a Gila monster open. Like, I don't mind watching someone fake murder an animal or like fake have sex with an animal, but it is pretty distressing.
It's definitely trying to toy with your, like, is this real?
Yes.
It's definitely trying to make you question whether
you
or not
have
it's
a
real.
moment,
I think
right?
the
You're
real
like,
animal sacrifice earlier on sort of problematizes the question for us. Yeah, no, we should be clear. There's not actual bestiality happening in the film, at least,
I think.
It doesn't seem so. Yeah. He's kind of overselling it a little bit.
Yeah.
It's kind of like movie sex.
I will say, for a movie with this title, it is impressive that it still finds ways to shock you, like, oh, they're doing that. Wow.
Yeah.
Like multiple
it definitely
times.
It more than lives up to its very evocative title, for sure.
Yeah.
And on the subject of the title, I mean, the two titles that it is most known by are either Mountain of the Cannibal God, the titular mountain that you see throughout the credit sequence and that we end up on, or Slave of the Cannibal God, which is the more instantly problematic of the titles, and I do feel like it is maybe the more fitting.
Yeah,
I feel like if you're gonna go there, go there.
Yeah, right. Let's just swing for the fences, right?
So Bennett, you've mentioned some animal cruelty, but you found a quote when a reporter asks Martino about the accusations that the film is both racist and cruel to animals. How did he respond, and do you feel his answer is justified?
It's pretty funny that he struck a kind of similarly defensive posture to how we saw Lucio Fulci respond to the accusations of violence in his films. He was like, well, it's nothing compared to those American blockbusters. And I'm sorry, I'm vamping as I'm pulling the quote up now, but he he basically suggested that his film is really nothing in comparison to the natural world or nature documentaries. He says, as far as I'm concerned, these films were inspired by American adventure cinema of the 40s, like King Solomon's Mines, and other American and European adventure cinema. I can understand the cruelty against animals charge, but the scene in which the python strangles the monkey, for instance, was shot almost by chance. Now, here's where it gets to be kind of a wild quote.
Yeah.
Admittedly, the monkey was put next to the snake, but it had every opportunity to escape. There was nothing inevitable about being killed. Anyway, in the jungle, the law of life is the law of survival. I don't believe, moreover, and this is, again, where he gets defensive, I don't believe, moreover, that the makers of all these respectable nature documentaries and TV just shoot what they find.
Sure.
And I guess I agree
Which
with
is
it
true.
there. Like, yeah,
That's
of course.
accurate.
It's all contrived, and they're all, guilty of probably plenty of animal cruelty, but
Sure.
come on, man.
But just because everyone else is doing it,
Yeah, two wrongs, a million wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Also, like, to be like, well, we captured that shot by chance. It's like you didn't put it in the movie by chance.
You introduced
Right,
the chance.
You intentionally cut it in.
It also just doesn't seem necessarily like a fair fight there. The monkey we see in the shot in question.
Yeah, we
looks
chucked
like
a small
tiny
monkey next to a giant hungry snake, and then just let nature do what nature does.
And it's such
Speaking
a
of,
long
that
scene.
sequence goes on for forever.
Yeah.
Speaking of the sort of fixating on the violence here, again, it's kind of Fulci-esque. We talked about in the Fulci episode how he lingers on like wounds and stuff. We get definitely with that monkey an extended sort of killing sequence.
Yeah.
And folks, the bestiality may be simulated, but that is most definitely not. So there's definitely some content here that I don't know. I don't find Martino's answer all that satisfactory. Like,
No.
He's right that nature documentaries are pretty complicit in all of this too, but I don't know, man. Like, I don't think he needs to apologize for the most, for me, the most, like, I think I made a barf shot in the movie, the Komodo dragon barfing up the snake. Like, I don't know. There's no reason to assume they fed that steak to the Komodo dragon.
Right.
But the monkey being eaten by the snake, being, like, crushed by the snake, that seems a little,
Yeah.
It feels real because well, Jim, one thing you mentioned in the notes is you said how ungrimy this film's production is. What do you mean by that? And what do you think it adds to the film?
Well, as opposed to the other, I haven't watched a ton of the cannibal movies because I don't like them, but I have watched Cannibal Holocaust and Cannibal Ferox because they both feel like things that I was supposed to watch at some point, so I did. Mm-hmm. And they very much root themselves in that sort of world of cheap documentary in a lot of ways, right? Like Holocaust, I think I already mentioned, they're like, here's previous footage from this documentary crew, this fictional documentary crew in the movie, and they show actual documentary footage of other atrocities, which sort of sets you up for things to feel extra real. It makes things sort of feel more impactful a little later on. But then the whole movie is shot like a sort of low budget documentary crew, right? Like you associate with found footage films, right? Where it's 16 millimeter, which is what you would have been doing at the time, and it's sort of like shaky, and it's in the same sort of milieu as like a Blair Witch Project, but earlier and in a different world. And this movie isn't. This movie is very much. I guess that makes sense, Bennett, that he's like pulling most of his inspiration from like 40s adventure Hollywood movies, because it is shot very much. It's like there's dolly shots. The camera work is nice. There's a really slick shot through Stacey Keach's house where we're like gliding across from room to room while they're walking around on the other end of the house, and it sort of features all of the sort of the things, the competence that we were talking about earlier, right? There's something about the sort of handheld sloppiness of like the faux documentary form that excuses showing nastier stuff.
You don't hold it against it.
Yeah, you're like, well, it feels like a documentary. It feels like they sort of captured stuff by happenstance, and you're like, oh, that's just whatever. But to be like, oh, this like full on whole crew set up lights around a monkey and a snake and then made them eat each other, right? There's something meaner about it that I don't know. Just to watch these sort of horrible things happen in high production value. It like has a worse message about humanity as a whole or something.
That opening title card too carries like a sense of import that like feels more real than like a documentary crew went into the jungles of Papua New Guinea. Like it feels like this is like, so we did some research into this and here's Hollywood's take on this.
Yeah. Yeah,
obviously it's not a Hollywood movie, but you know what I mean? Like,
this isn't just like 4 people with a camera. This is like, there's money behind this. a lot of people decided that what we're showing you was a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, it is something. It's the masks that the cannibal tribe wears.
Ooh, so scary.
Yeah.
They're creepy as hell, but we're,
Definitely actual dead animals, like apes or something, right?
I don't know, but
I couldn't tell. Yeah.
yeah.
It's hard to tell.
But it's a testament to how gross a lot of this movie is that we're 25 minutes into this section and just now touching on the actual,
they're horrifying
written
aesthetics.
portions of the horror. Yeah. Because, the middle is kind of a cat and mouse game again, where it's like, oh, we're in the jungle. We got to be careful. But, how do you feel about those scenes with, I guess, the hunt would be the way to say it?
When the bad tribe is sort of showing up and attacking.
Yeah.
They're running away. I don't know. It's gnarly.
It's scary. I mean, the polished certainly does not diminish the actual real visceral horror of it. I don't know. It never ceases to be upsetting to me, seeing someone get disemboweled. I don't know. Something about visceral trauma is worse. Like trauma of the torso is just is worse to me than someone getting beheaded. And we do get a great decapitation in this.
For sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think once again, Martino just is super competent, and there's a real sense of geography and space and stuff. It doesn't have the dreamlike randomness that you might be given to naturally associate with Italian genre cinema.
Yeah, it does. It's those masks you just mentioned, Craig, are I spent a good amount of time trying to decide if they were actual dried ape faces or if they were something that an art department made, right? And I don't know. And that is it's again, it's Martino's. This is the same as putting ice in a bolt lock instead of some sort of wild, fanciful thing, right? All of his stuff feels like it's rooted in stuff that could be real.
Yeah.
And it leaves you guessing, right? You're never 100% sure how upset to be. And that makes it more upsetting.
And much like in Mrs. Wardh, it's sort of bombards you with a ton of narrative twists and contrivances all at once, kind of right at the end. And it's more unmooring and more upsetting than it was in Mrs. Wardh because, we're out in the fucking jungle with these people. We now I don't know what to think. And I've followed these people along, and I'm supposed to be rooting for them, and I'm supposed to be oh, these are people I can trust. And it's a tough situation to be in, when you don't know who to trust during that ending sacrifice. I don't know. It's a very daring move to pull the rug out from under us and upset our alliances before subjecting us to this insane extended torture ceremony.
Because it's sort of the same pacing, right? There's an hour-ish. And then a bunch of insane stuff happens.
All the reveals. A half an hour, basically, of torture.
But in Mrs. Wardh, you're watching a murder mystery. Right. In this, you think you're watching some people who are headed for some doom in the jungle.
A pretty point A to point B journey. Yeah, you're not expecting a bunch of
But then it's
twists.
ha ha ha. Also, everything you thought was true was a lie. And you're wait, hold on a second.
No one's likable. Yeah.
Yeah. I hate all. And this just another similarity to Mrs. Wardh. It also ends with a weird romance angle that I didn't see or want.
Where you're I don't think I want these characters together.
Yeah.
So one thing we talked about last year with the Wes Craven stuff is he was a director who he was really trying to push horror to its grossest, darkest places. And, Last House on the Left, obviously he got pretty out there. But when you see something like this, where there's cannibalism, there's bestiality, there's beheadings, there's real monkeys being eaten by snakes, what's left? I mean, no one's gonna feel good after seeing this movie. It's just such a different reaction. I mean, what's your take on the after effects of this movie?
Well, yeah, to return to the idea of how daring it is to paint all of the characters in such an unsavory light. They swim away at the end, and it's oh, these two shitty people got away from this tribe. What am I supposed to think about this? I don't know. It's not a movie you can feel good about. I don't know. It's why I definitely I know Split Pix is supposed to be a movie you're recommending, and this is definitely while I think it is a competent piece of filmmaking, even a quite effective piece of filmmaking, it's maybe not a movie I would recommend watching more than once.
It's more of a conversation starter.
It's more of hey, did you know Martino made a cannibal movie with Stacey Keach and Ursula Andress? It makes an interesting companion with Isle of the Fishman.
It does super effectively do what it's trying to do. I also, if anybody, if you're looking for a recommendation, maybe watch the first 75 minutes. But skip over every time an animal shows up.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. If you see an animal on screen, just hit that 30-second skip.
Yeah.
A couple times.
Yeah.
So going back to Craven, though, because like his whole thing was like he wanted his movies to make you uncomfortable, and this one does. And then we get to modern horror, and I feel like there is just this notion that like modern horror should be fun and like they should all be kind of funny. It's just it's so different. Where
awful.
Yeah. I mean, if you show people something from what was this 1978. Most modern horror fans will think this is the grossest movie they've ever seen.
Oh, sure, it's way grosser than most modern horror. Way grosser.
Yeah.
But we sort of get a division, right, in like the 90s, 2000s, where we get like, and Wes Craven is partially culpable, right? He switches from doing Last House on the Left to doing
Scream.
Scream and Shocker,
postmodern
right?
movies.
Yeah. But we sort of get this division where we get like fun time, because I think horror was like sort of an undergroundy genre, right? It was playing at cinemas that were trying to attract audiences away from Hollywood. So when Hollywood gets into the horror game, we start to get like the Hollywood, right? Like the approachable horror that can play in a mall. So we start getting that, but then we also get like what the Japanese guinea pig movies, right? And the Saw movie, right? We start getting things that are like instead of being a fun time full of jokes. I mean, I guess the Saw movies are sort of blending it, right? But we start getting sort of the like grimiest version of horror where we're like, this is literally just an hour and a half of a man being dissected and you can't tell if it's real or not. Right? Yeah.
So Bennett, you wrote a really great piece about the Saw franchise. One of the things you talk about a lot in that is the term torture porn. Do you want to discuss that, or do you want to just send people to the essay?
The term torture porn was coined in the mid-aughts when the Saw movies were kind of in their initial heyday, basically to describe the Saw movies, Hostel, Passion of the Christ, movies that really sort of luxuriated in suffering and were ostensibly horror movies, but didn't really have a lot of scares. They were, only like scary or upsetting in the sense that they featured people being subjected to bodily harm. And unlike slasher, other sort of like subgenre type terms that are like maybe derisive, I don't think torture porn was ever like reclaimed by filmmakers or fans. Like it is like exclusively a derisive term. And it really, like those movies served kind of the same purpose that slashers did in the 80s or like postmodern slashers did in the 90s, of like upsetting a lot of people who really appreciated the sort of like revolutionary spirit of horror films. Like a lot of people, like your Robin Woods, saw slashers as like just sort of reifying conservative tendencies.
Sure, like everyone who has sex dies. Ha.
Everyone who has sex gets killed is sort of the famous example of how that's embodied. Torture porn was a way of just sort of like shitting on movies that they thought featured like excessive gore.
But even those, right? Even those lack the sort of rawness that Martino is willing to go. I mean, partially because we now have like the ASPCA, right? Hollywood does, right? You can't feed a monkey to a snake and be like, whoops. But also I don't think most people these days would want to. And also I think if you chucked that into a movie that you released to a wide audience, you would probably get a lot of flack in 2022, right?
Definitely. Yeah.
It is impossible to make a movie that is exactly as upsetting as something like this film, I think, in the modern world, without really running into some trouble.
Eli Roth tried. Eli Roth of the torture porn.
Oh, right. Green.
Of torture porn fame made a movie called The Green Inferno, which is kind of like this in the sense that it's like unlikable characters being subjected to the torture. At least like he frames them as unlikable in a kind of super conservative way. They're all like campus activist types. Not
weird.
great.
It's weird.
Yeah. I mean, I think torture porn, if we're going to call it that, cannibal films are among the types of movies that it's riffing on for sure. It's the last act of this movie, which is just this sort of like big ceremony. That is sort of a central feature, I think, of the subgenre. And I think they're all kind of calling back. I mentioned King Kong, the Peter Jackson version. I think like King Kong, like the original, is another like touchstone. I think that's sort of like travelogue films featuring, quote unquote primitive cultures. It all sort of feeds into a soup that ends up in torture porn, with I guess Green Inferno being the logical endpoint. Probably never get another jungle cannibal movie, at least not for a long time.
Yeah, probably not for a while.
Yeah, I mean, that movie just felt like it existed to be controversial, and that was its sole purpose.
That movie is what people who hate the Saw movies think the Saw movies are.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, just to exist just to be upsetting. is all about just like luxuriating in the character's suffering.
Yeah, and it was another one where my roommate in college was like, "We should watch this. It's so gross that someone threw up at the premiere."
Right.
And it was like,
Cool.
okay.
That was how Saw was first presented to me at football practice. I remember a kid saying, "It's the grossest movie I've ever seen," and I was like, "Whoa."
That's like a tradition that goes back to like William Castle, right? Of like
100%,
you hire an ambulance to sit outside, and then everyone's like, "Well, I have to watch it because somebody passed out
Someone
or whatever."
passed out.
They still do. People do that at like Cannes every year. They'll like hire an ambulance to sit outside and be like, "Wah!"
And the movies they're talking about are getting worse and worse.
Yeah.
Guys, for all of its upsetting content, Slave of the Cannibal God is infinitely better than Titan. All right, let me tell you.
I like Titan, but okay.
All right, well, sorry.
All right. Well, I think you've both hinted that it's not really a competition between Strange Vice and Cannibal God, but
I mean, if you're gonna try to enjoy a movie, I would definitely go with literally any of his gialli.
Yeah, I think my Martino rankings are literally like his 5 gialli and then Slave of the Cannibal God with Mrs. Wardh up top. I think really one of the best of the subgenre. Whether you're new to it or you're a Argento Bava Fulci fan, dip into the Martino films. A lot of them are on Shudder, a lot of them are on Tubi.
You'll learn something. You'll learn something about the genre, I think.
so I think the last thing I want to touch on is we originally planned to do 4 episodes for this series with Mario Bava being the 4th, but time permitting, we had to pick one over the other. And I think we were all more interested in talking about Sergio Martino because he is not generally listed as a tier 1 director, but Mario Bava he's an institution. He's been covered. Sure. I actually had some trouble trying to find quotes from Martino because most of the stuff that's out there is either in Italian or just non-existent.
This little book is basically the best you can do. The book Arrow put out is like, I think, the most substantial Martino writing out there.
Is that what his face looks like on the cover there?
It's like 60 pages, yeah.
He's so goddamn cool.
Right? He's kind of hot.
Yeah.
Don't know if there's a question there, but do you maybe want to talk about Bava versus
I'm glad we
Martino?
talked about Martino. I'm glad this is the direction we went.
Yeah.
It does feel like just in terms of sort of the scope of your whole series, right? I feel like the Argento, Fulci, Bava, they're obviously different people making different movies, but there's sort of there's like a cohesion to the way that all of them are making movies. And I feel like Martino, and we've talked about this at length maybe, but Martino sort of breaks away from, I think, the same. It feels like they're all working within sort of the same conventions, and he's working on a different, more sort of reality grounded way. And it makes, I don't know, it's I think I'm like more familiar with the other guys. I hadn't really seen much of Martino's work, and I'm so happy that I watched a bunch of his movies to do this because they're just all great. They're all just great movies.
So good, yeah. I wish he'd crossed over into Hollywood because it seems like he'd be the most likely to have been able to sort of like adapt to the system.
Yeah.
Like, I almost wish he'd come along, like 20 years later when like there maybe might have been like more of a market for that.
Oh yeah.
There's an episode in the book they relate like him going to visit the Shaw brothers in Hong Kong, maybe thinking about like making a movie with Jackie Chan, which unfortunately never happened. Like, God, that would have been so cool.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, that would. Yeah. Darn. But yeah, he did do some more work in TV. He obviously directed more movies after both of these, but I just feel like Arrow I think is doing amazing work with Bennett. You showed the book. They have, Sergio Martino collection. They have a few other films they've released, but I don't know. He just seems like one of the guys who I feel like should be a little more prominent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's great. I don't know. I hope that he only rises in people's estimations. I mean, obviously we mentioned he's still with us. It's a morbid thing to reflect on, but I imagine when he's not, that'll invite some reappraisal and some people to sort of like re-explore his work. But I hope it doesn't take that. I hope in his lifetime he can be sort of celebrated. Because not a dud in the bunch of like the 14 of his films that I've seen. I mean, obviously, like we talked about a lot in our discussion of Slave of the Cannibal Gods. Our Slave of the Cannibal God singular. There's just one Cannibal God, folks. And he's a man, and he's got a long beard.
And he watches you do everything.
And he's watching you do everything. He's watching you right now. As we talked about in our discussion of that, maybe I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend all of these because you sort of have to have a strong stomach, a strong.
You should know,
for,
right?
Some of the more upsetting flights of fancy of like Italian genre film. But like Case of the Scorpion's Tail, Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh, All the Colors of the Dark, Your Vice. These are real heavy hitters. I mean, if you were making a list of the 10 best gialli,
Suspicious Death of a Minor.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
another great one.
Yeah.
They're all bangers. Usually when I come on and do split picks, I then don't watch anything else by that director for a long time because I've like had to immerse myself. But I'm staying on the path of Martino's for a while. I think everything I've watched has been awesome, and I haven't touched on 8 genres he's worked in. So like I have to watch some of his sex romps. I have to watch some of his sports movies. Right? Yeah.
I want to see the soccer comedy.
Yeah.
Listeners, his latest film from like 2008 is a soccer comedy. The poster is a guy having clearly been hit in the testicles by, I guess, a soccer ball. It looks like a lot of fun.
It's a sequel to a movie he made in like 1980, starring the same dude.
It's a sequel.
Right?
Yeah.
So you got to watch both, I think.
Well, I think that is probably a good place to stop for today, unless you guys have any final concluding thoughts or...
Watch some Martino.
Yeah, echo that. Check him out, folks. Tubi or
Tubi.
Shudder.
Hit up that Tubi.
Cool. Well, we will wrap this series up here today. Thank you for listening. Bennett, thank you for doing all 3 of these episodes. Or 4, I guess. We split ours into 2. Jim, always a blast having you around.
Yeah, nice to be here.
We'll get the 3 of us together again soon. But we've got one more week of October horror coming up. You're going to see some things from Bennett about Saw coming this week.
To the listeners, I have a question. Want to play a game?
I think that is going to do it. Thank you for listening. If you liked any of these episodes, it's a huge help if you can share them, give them a like, whatever. We'll be back next year. We're gonna pick the next country. I think that's probably the way to go. So you'll be hearing from us soon.